today we're going to talk about the TCFD, two of the pillars for TCFD, the strategy and governance pillars. One of my colleagues who has done a lot of work with a number of the scenario modelers and scenario builders will join for the strategy session. And then I'll return also for the governance session. And then at the end, near the end of that governance session, we can also have more of a general wrap up for the day. And tomorrow, a bit of a similar structure, but we'll conclude with the remaining two pillars and then go on, as I said, to scenarios and scenario analysis. So with that as the structure, we'll talk first about the climate risks themselves, and just specifically what are climate risks? How do they manifest? What do they look like? What are the risks that Ireland experiences? Then we'll get into a little bit of what the relevance of those risks are for financial institutions, but also for the real economy. And then we'll talk a little bit about goals and guidance. We'll then further go into just some of the newest regulatory developments from the EU with their strategy and action plan that's come up, as well as movements in other jurisdictions and what they say about the expectations on both financial institutions and corporates. So to just jump in for us on climate risks, one of the reasons that we're having this session and one of the reasons that climate risks are important is their role in overall markets and in financial markets specifically, and recognizing them not as a standalone type of risk, but rather as a risk that needs to be fully integrated and included in other types of risks. So this is a series of existing hazards worsening. It's a series of new hazards affecting operations, affecting financial positions in new and varied ways. But ultimately, the structuring, and we'll talk a bit about this in the risk management and governance portions of the program, those things are really important for us in moving forward and really ensuring that that not only do we have the right information, but that markets and the overall economic systems have the right knowledge of these climate risks and opportunities to effectively allocate capital, to effectively drive the change that science says is necessary. So maybe now to start a little bit on that science and to talk a little bit about climate change and ask this question of, I promise for those of you who love science, there's a lot more that we can talk about offline. For those of you that hate science, there isn't too much in here, so I don't want to scare anyone off, but I do think it is sometimes helpful to begin with just what do we know, and then we can go into what does that mean in more of a regional context. So what we know about climate is that climate does always change, but what is unique and remarkable over the last few decades is the speed at which that change has occurred, which has been unprecedentedly fast, and also the driver of that change, which is human activity. And those are two phenomena that are unique, and from a human perspective, 50, 60 years may seem like quite a long time. In terms of the geologic record, this is a blink of the eye. And so what's both worrisome as well as really notable is as we've begun to track the levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere from industrial times all the way up till about World War II, we saw a relative rise of about 30 parts per million. Then moving on into the 1960s, the parts per million began to accelerate. And so what the chart on the right is showing is the average annual increase. So you can see in the 60s and 70s, this was about 1 part per million per year, whereas in the 2000s and early 2010s, it was more than 2 parts per million per year. So it's not just that there's more CO2, it's also that the rate at which it's getting into the atmosphere is rising. And so if we look on the left-hand side here, we can see this relationship between the rise of carbon dioxide shown by the gray line and the temperature anomalies experienced over that same period. And a lot of people talk about climate change as loading the dice. And I think that that's a good way to put it, because when you have normal climate, you're always going to have extremes, but those extremes should be two-sided. There should be really cold weather and there should be really hot weather. There should also be, really dry conditions, really wet conditions. But with climate change, one of the things that is notable is as the planet has warmed by over 1 degree centigrade, what we've noticed is that die that we're rolling for those extreme events is almost always coming up on one of the red faces, on one of the hot sides. And you can see all of the red, yellow, and orange shows areas of warming between 1884 and 2018. The areas of blue show cooling. And it's one, notable to see how much the warming dominates the cooling, but also to recognize that the areas that have warmed fastest are some of the most northerly latitudes. These are places where the impacts of climate change are also most severe on transforming ecosystems, on transforming land, whether that's melting permafrost in Russia, disrupting an oil pipeline, whether that's sea ice melting in northern Alaska, causing disruption for local wildlife, or whether it's ice melting and not forming in a solid mass at the North Pole, which is leading to the potential for the ability of ships to transit over the Northwest Passage for longer parts of the year. So these are all changes taking place. And I think very often we tend to think about climate, and I'll pause after this page, but I think we tend to think about climate in a very prescribed way of thinking about rising sea levels. And sometimes we think about worsening storms, but climate is really an energy problem. And it's an energy problem of adding more energy to a system makes that system behave in more destructive and more often challenging ways. And so it's not to say that everything would be better if we were in an ice age. That's not the case, but rather perturbations from a climate that we have adapted to can be problematic, not just because sea levels rise, not just because storms may strengthen, but also because there are a number of related health and social effects, whether it's the sort of direct and obvious extreme heat being dangerous to workers and damaging to national productivity, whether it's the desertification of crop areas, which may result in food shortages, whether it's increased flooding in certain areas that results in displaced people, or whether it's pathogens being able to spread more widely because of the fact that they're adapted to a warmer environment. And so places that were previously too cool are now able to be a habitat for them. So the main point in thinking about climate and the risks, and we've mostly just talked about the physical side, and I'll speak a little bit about the economics next. But as we go into this exploration, the constant question and tie back will be, well, how does this link to our business? How does this link these potential physical damages? And on the next pages, we talk about economic damages, how those economic damages link to our business. Fundamentally, I think good climate risk management is about a translation exercise of how do we take the climate inputs and make them into information that is relevant for our decision making. So as I said, let me pause here before I go into some of the economic impacts and types of climate risks. On the economic side, this is a little bit trickier. And granted, with climate change, it's always hard to say that this effect will happen. The bigger the system that we're talking about, whether we're talking about geographically or effects, the significantly easier it will be for us to make strong and scientifically provable claims. That's one of the reasons why economic harms are quite a challenge to project. But a number of studies, this one from Stanford in 2015, others from the Stern review by Nicholas Stern back in 2006, as well as a number of other researchers, have looked at the economic damages, so just wrought by the physical impacts, but also the effects of displacement and the potential effects of lower growth due to things like heat stress, due to limits in fresh water. And by and large, while northern countries may still see relative growth, with uncontrolled climate change, the more we go on, the more those effects begin to accumulate. And so, for example, more optimal growing temperatures in northern latitudes become significantly more damaging when then they lead to stronger rainstorms, when they introduce new pests into those latitudes. So it's not necessarily the case that the short-term beneficiaries of climate changes will be also the long-term beneficiaries. By and large, the costs of adaptation and the costs of the damages themselves are going to be significant. And while hard to exactly project, this tends to have a lot to do with what sort of discounting rates you use, how you value the future. But fundamentally, the economic challenges, and we'll talk about them in the case of Ireland, are real and are meaningful to consider. And just to go on from that and to kind of dive in a little bit to how we think about the types of physical and transition risks, these two types of climate change. When I think about physical risks, and we'll talk for the next few pages about the comparisons here, when we talk about physical risks, what we're really referring to are the effects of climate. When the climate changes, what does that mean for water? What does that mean for storms? What does that mean for soil? What are the things that actually are disrupted by the changed climatic system? And the way to think about that typically is in terms of what are called incremental risks, which is a shifting baseline. So you probably saw in the Pacific Northwest last week, the temperatures that were remarkably high, 40, 45 degrees centigrade. And they said that those were made about 100 times more likely by climate change. And so that's not to say that every day will be that hot, but rather that the underlying trend of days, the underlying distribution of weather will fundamentally change, making those extreme events from extremely unlikely to just relatively rare, and in some cases, even somewhat common. So that is the shifting baseline, which we'll call incremental risks when we explore it in more detail. Then we also look at extreme events. These are the ones that catch the headlines. These are the ones in the news, the short-term events that could be potentially exacerbated, whether they're wildfires, whether they're heat waves. These are the short-term manifestations of changes in the climate system. They are the tail of that distribution of incremental risks. Now, transition risk is a little different. Transition risk is really the risk that is posed by the transition to a low carbon economy. So what firms are prepared to make that transition, which ones are not? And for a financial institution, that may be, who do you give capital to? Where are your investments? For a corporate, it may be your own business. So what is happening to your customer base? It may be in your supply chain. So what is happening to suppliers? Are they using something or producing something that won't be economically viable due to a changing climate policy? So these are the kinds of considerations on the transition side. And typically we think about them in terms of policy, technology, and markets. Policy risks being the risks that policy changes will have a negative impact on the on the business, on the sector. So this could be, say, a carbon tax or a carbon border adjustment for an exporting nation that doesn't have carbon pricing. Technology risks can be the level of disruption that comes from shifting economics and what the impacts are from new technologies coming in. So when solar is outpricing coal, it may not be just the case that people don't want to use coal, but also the case that with something cheaper and more efficient, you actually have a market that has the potential to strand significant assets. So coal power plants that are built but are no longer economic, coal mines that have been invested in. And so these kind of technology risks can drive the acceleration of obsolescence, can drive potential losses in companies. And then market risks can be changes in overall consumer or financial market sentiment that causes either a revaluation in the value of an institution. So, oh, well, we actually don't think that that is a viable business anymore, meaning that somebody is more likely to dump that business, which may find itself having trouble raising capital. Or it may be shifts in consumer preferences of we don't want to fly as much anymore. And so as a result, that's going to have adverse consequences on airlines. So recognizing how these three types of transition risks fit together is a helpful way of thinking about how climate, not from its physical manifestations, but from its impacts on the environment, the economic environment, can bring about change. So just a couple quick pages on the comparisons between transition and physical risks and how I think it's often helpful to think about them. On the transition side, I would typically think about emissions, and specifically carbon dioxide emissions. Many of the other emissions are important, but they tend to be relatively short-lived in the atmosphere, which means that if we stop emitting them at some certain point, then in a short period of time, most of them will have dissipated. Carbon dioxide tends to be more longer-lived in the atmosphere. A couple other gases are, but carbon dioxide far and away is the biggest of the human-produced greenhouse gases. And so when we think about the transition, typically the driver of that transition is how quickly we are cutting our emissions. If emissions don't need to fall or can fall very slowly, then we're typically going to see significantly lower transition risk. If emissions have to fall very quickly, then we're going to see significantly higher levels of transition risk. And essentially the steepness of that emissions curve will be the thing that tells you what type of transition scenario you're facing. For physical risks, the key modifier, key indicator is really temperature. While there are some nonlinear relationships between extreme events and temperatures, there are some that respond in nonlinear ways to temperature increases. Across all of the different risks we face, it can generally be said that there's a positive relationship between temperature and the overall level of risk and severity of that risk. And what that means is when you look at a given scenario or you look at a given pathway that you're on, what is the implied temperature or what is the expected temperature of that scenario will tell you a lot about the severity of the physical impacts. And as a result of these two types of risks, physical and transition, we can really think about these risks in a sort of 2x2 matrix that gives us 4 potential future storylines. And this work comes from the Network on Greening the Financial System, which we'll talk significantly more about in our scenario section, talk about some of their work. We'll also mention them at the end of this session. But fundamentally, the key here is that you have both transition as well as physical risks that you face. And how those proceed will tell you whether you're likely to experience more physical risks, more transition risks, or more transition risks, whether there's a trade-off, or whether the outcome is just a suboptimal one where we don't achieve our climate goals and we also have major economic impacts. So the 4 types, thinking about the best, going from the best case scenario and moving moving clockwise, is to start with the orderly scenario. This is the recognition of rapid and aggressive action to reduce emissions, but starting now and following the most measured way possible with coordination and cooperation across borders. And we can see that that limits the degree of transition risk. Will there still be businesses that go out of business? Will there still be economic challenges for certain sectors? Absolutely. But there'll also be lots of opportunities and lots of creation. The next side, which is the goals of emissions reduction are met, is the disorderly scenario. This is significantly more challenging because under a disorderly scenario, what we see is that there's a rapid response to climate policies, and it is uneven, and the uptake occurs at later points in different places. And so because of that, a lot of global markets are either disrupted, or alternatively, policies that are brought in need to be particularly strict in order to ensure that these types of restrictions on emissions are effectively implemented. So again, that's going to be more disruptive and challenging, but we'll still reach our climate goals. Now, if we go over to the top right, this too little too late scenario is one where we put in the effort to make the change, but we don't go far enough. And we recognize that in this case, we sort of have accumulating physical effects that we need to worry about, but we also have some transition effects from the failure of that climate policy. So this is a scenario that hasn't really been run as much by the Network for Greening the Financial System, but is part of this matrix. The last one, the hothouse world scenario, is one where there isn't a huge amount of pressure on the emitting industries and emitting companies to do anything differently. But at the same time, they are more suspect and subject to increased physical risks because of the fact that the temperature has continued to warm. So within each of these, we have this question of whether our goals are met, as well as the levels of challenge for each of the scenarios. And so scenarios that are going to be in the bottom left corner are going to be the ones that are most ambitious and perhaps most efficient. Ones in the top right are going to be ones that are particularly damaging. And most scenarios will fall as orderly, disorderly, or hothouse, rather than you seeing too many of the kind of too little, too late scenarios. So recognizing this is the sort of trade-off between physical and transition risks, we can talk now a little bit about what some of those risks mean for Ireland. But before we do, just again to take a quick pause and see what questions you might have. So moving on to the specifics within Ireland, we'll talk a little bit about how some of these physical and transition risks manifest, and see what other thoughts and questions you have there before going into that more translation exercise that I mentioned about how we take some of these insights and outputs, how we convert them to financial impacts. So going first on the physical risks, there's definitely increased risks of flooding from greater rainfall patterns. There's also greater likelihood of extreme weather. And one of the things to note is how Ireland's temperature has risen over the last decades. You can see, and this was true in many countries as well, a bit of this dip from the 60s to the 70s. Typically, that is attributed largely to aerosols. So as the post-war world kind of re-industrialized, one of the big things used were aerosols until they were recognized as being harmful to human and animal health. So one of the things that it didn't really stop the warming, but in some ways masked that warming between 1960 and 1980, was really the use of aerosols on this chart below. From a transition side, there's definitely a lot of policy energy that is moving and that is eager to see Ireland become a green leader, and also that will drive some of the big challenges for getting firms to align to this. Also, as a member of the EU, there's a number of EU statutes that will have relevance when considering the policy impacts. And then from a technology side, the question is more how new technologies have the potential to disrupt old forms of business. And then, just like many other places, it's subject to various market disruptions and market changes. So maybe just to talk a little more detail about some of the areas of risk that we've looked at and analyzed. One of the challenges with Ireland is going to be related to water. And one of the reasons, of course, it's the Emerald Isle and it's so green has to do with the amount of water that it gets. And yet, in some places, more water would actually result in flooding. In other places, more water can increase runoff, so damaging topsoil and carrying it to the sea. And in other cases, you can see just significant changes in the wet and dry pattern. So what's both paradoxical and interesting about climate is that climate often brings an area stronger storms, but also more dry periods. So when it does rain, you do have that potential for topsoil erosion, for coastal erosion, rather than what you might have if you were in a more moderate climate of rain. And so the increase in severity also creates a bit of a dynamic where either there's not enough rain or there's too much rain. On the fisheries, as an important part of economic activities, one of the things that warming will do is potentially threaten shellfish populations. It may also lead to different migratory patterns as well as different fish in the seas around Ireland. And so it's important to think about that from a perspective of how it affects commercial fishing. Finally, on flooding itself, there are real and distinct impacts on real estate, recognizing that rises in sea level not only increase flooding, as many people know, but actually worsen existing flooding. And the way they do this is by having a flood that not only affects the immediate area, but actually starts from a higher level because of higher sea levels. And that was one of the cases in Hurricane Sandy, where what we saw was a number of houses, I think about 84,000, were impacted because the sea level had already risen by about a foot in New York Harbor. And so recognizing that these factors together can make the risks higher and worse than they otherwise would be. Again, on the rising seas, there's threats to wetland ecosystems. There's also the potential for stronger winter storms and potentially heavier storms. On agriculture, there are some of those risks I mentioned around change in productivity. In the short term, it seems that warmer temperatures will increase productivity, but over the longer period, damages to crops from storms, as well as changes in growth patterns, may not actually be as positive as hoped. And so that's on the food production side. From an infrastructure standpoint, any of these extreme events have the potential to threaten infrastructure. On the transition side, it's a bit of a different story in the sense that Ireland itself doesn't produce, massive amounts of emissions through heavy industry or through extraction. And yet there are a few important things to note. One is, as a financial hub, there's the big potential for financed emissions and the potential for companies to face either pressure to reduce emissions to align with financed emissions goals, or to make changes because of the financed emissions themselves. Another piece is on energy dependency, which we'll talk a little bit about. But in terms of policy, as we said, I think, and what we'll talk about near the end of this session, there's quite a lot of initiatives underway, whether from the legally binding framework that is currently, still waiting for final approval on net zero by 2050, to other commitments that have been made by the country that will now need to be fulfilled by the business community. And recognizing some of the challenges, one of them is that external energy sources have been a big part of Irish power production. You can see here the EU is in red, Ireland to the right is in green. There's significantly more of an importing and need for external fuels in Ireland than there is in the rest of the EU overall. By and large, we're talking about imports of over half the total consumption. And there's also the recognition that with Brexit, potential connections and energy relationships with Great Britain might be somewhat impacted. On the fuel side, right now, there is some diversification underway, but as you can see from the total use, there's quite a lot of fossil fuels that are still in the system. And so even though you can kind of see that blue growing, you're also seeing the rate of oil grow. You're also seeing the rate of gas be relatively flat. And one positive, you are definitely seeing the reduction in coal to levels that are comparable with peat. Both of those are very emissions intensive sources, so that's good to see. But a really full-on transformation of this energy system would be necessary to bring it into line with some of the stated climate goals. So I'll talk a little bit about transmission mechanisms of climate risk, but just, of course, want to see any thoughts or questions before I get into that. So as I said earlier, fundamentally, climate change is a exercise in translation, and that translation is, how do we take outputs like stronger storms or warmer temperatures? How do we take things like that, and how do we actually drive forward with it? How do we actually say, what does this mean for my business? And typically the way that that is understood is through a number of transmission channels. And so the idea is that both on the physical and the transition side, these risks can have various economic impacts, as well as various business level impacts. So the macro and micro respectively. The recognition there is, once you've converted these risks into various macroeconomic or microeconomic, so thinking about cash flows or balance sheets, once you've converted the impacts that these scenario variables have on those, then fundamentally it's just another risk exercise. And that's why you see here credit risk, market risk, underwriting, operations, and liquidity, because at the heart of it, climate should not have its own box. Climate will play into each. Climate will make it so a borrower is less likely to be able to pay back a loan because of the fact that their assets have been significantly written down under credit risk. Another example may be a national exchange falls significantly in value because of the recognition that carbon isn't being adequately priced into the system. From an underwriting perspective or a client or business engagement perspective, working with a partner, a supplier, a potential client that isn't well prepared for the economic transition can also pose risk. On the operational side, there's both legal risks in terms of things like both the legal likelihood of events being attributed to a given company, as well as to that company's source of capital. And then finally, on the liquidity risk, if you're a company that's largely trading on your assets, such as reserves, a massive stranding or massive revaluation of those may have adverse conditions on the liquidity you had previously counted on. The Bank of England made this helpful graphic as well that sort of explains both how physical and transition risks can have implications on credit market and operational risks. And fundamentally, that is one of the key ways that we think about this is once you split by physical and transition, what are the credit market and operational risks that are experienced? And you can see on the operational side, business continuity. You can see also the reputational risk side, but also this is more on the modeling side. You see changes like more severe weather leading to repricing because of fears of non-repayment. You see on the transition side, rising carbon taxes, either spurring protectionism or causing economic slowdowns. But these are the ways in which the stories we tell about how these pieces connect. The FSB had done a number of analyses around the EU economy and asking under various scenarios, what are the effects on GDP? And you can see under this, a negative 2% growth rate in the second quarter of 2021. If you apply an abrupt shock, you can also see for the private sector that significant loan losses also occur. What's interesting is to see that by the end of the technology scenarios, where there's more of an opportunity to take advantage of the opportunities, you can actually see more of the positive side. But likely in the short term, there will be some negative hits. And that's why it's important not just to mix and match these things, but to recognize where they would fit into discussions around capital and also where they would fit in other areas. So that's what I would cover here on climate risks. And I think all of this up to this point has really been building toward the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. Essentially, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures was developed in 2015. As you can see here, the goal is to provide information and support to help reach our climate goals, and to do that through using financial markets as a way of making these assessments and as a way of specifically going into the decision-making process. So it's not just on the shelf as a disclosure, but really reflective of the risks you face. At its heart, the TCFD is a simple structure of 4 pillars. The goal of these pillars is to really describe the activities the organization is undertaking across its operations when it comes to climate risks and climate disclosures. That begins with governance and asking the question of what policies and procedures are in place in order to address climate risk. From a strategy side, this is a little bit about the decision makers and what is being set as the path forward. What are the new opportunities surfaced? What are the risks to watch out for? And then risk management is the specific analyses that are done in that risk ID, risk assessment, and overall execution processes. Finally, on the metrics and targets, these are a key source of quantified data for stakeholders as well as internally. And so they allow for a greater comparability as well as greater cross conversation between various various stakeholders who are looking at different sectors or different institutions. Within each of these, and I'm not going to read these out because we're going to spend a good amount of time in each of our following sections going through them. But what I would just say is on the governance side, the goal is really to look at, for the company's risks and opportunities, how are those risks and opportunities being overseen? On the strategy side, as I said, it's what sort of analytics as well as what type of strategy do you want to develop and set. Risk management is about how we integrate some of these climate insights into our risk practices, and the metrics and targets provide a critical point of comparability across regions as well as in the more general space of TCFD. And so underneath each of these, and we'll talk about them and provide some good practice examples of them, underneath each of these are recommended disclosures. There are 11 total. One of the minor updates previously and in the ongoing consultation for the TCFD is this process of thinking about, are there additional or related disclosures? Most of what we've seen has been more to more explicitly lay out the metrics and targets, or to more explicitly explain or explore what governance policies are in place. So the idea of scope change is something that exists, but will largely change within this framework. And I think the value of the framework is it tends to be relatively adaptable and also adaptive. The TCFD itself is interesting and worthwhile to talk about for those maybe who don't know as much of its background. So the task force was set up by Mark Carney, former governor of the Bank of England, as well as Michael Bloomberg, former mayor of New York City. And the critical point here was this recognition of market failures due to a lack of clarity around how the work of understanding, measuring, and managing climate risks could be effectively done. And so for this work, there were a number of critical pieces that got put together in 2017 to issue those 11 initial pieces of guidance, as you saw here. At present, in a lot of ways, that those TCFD guidances have become a bit of the de facto standard for disclosure. We see a number of regulators using the TCFD as a standard for their own disclosure requirements, or aiming to elaborate on portions of the TCFD framework in order to meet their own particular and specific needs. And so some of the big takeaways at present are that there's just been rapid growth. I even had to update this slide from a few weeks ago, really rapid growth in the number of TCFD supporters, those who are interested in planning on issuing a TCFD report. There's also a need to bring some of the information around actual quantitative metrics to the fore. There's a lot of narrative, there's a lot of discussion, and all of that is good, but it doesn't always yield comparable results, and it doesn't always give investors and other stakeholders what they need to know about the company and its exposure. The latest updates from the TCFD are around the development of some guidance on particular metrics, including more guidance around emissions metrics, the use of a shadow carbon price, the breakout of different assets within sensitive zones, as well as questions like executive compensation and also capital expenditure, more of the financial aspects of guidance. And so while it's in a current consultative phase, we expect much of what the TCFD has shared to be something that carries forward into revised expectations. So on the next page, the other piece that the TCFD looked at, and I don't want to go into too much detail because we'll talk a little bit about some of these planning pieces later, is just to say in their most recent disclosure, they also spoke about transition plans as well as about target setting. So there was a supplement specifically about portfolio alignment. And so the TCFD gave high-level guidance, which you can see here on the right side of the page, but also went significantly deeper into the areas where there's a need to really define and improve some of these metrics, and also where there's a need to define how disclosure fits within, how target setting fits within disclosure. And I think what has been seen through this is some support from organizations like ours that this is the right direction, but also a real need to kind of continue to clarify and specify what the particulars are when it comes to any of these reports, because while more is good, it needs to be clear and it needs to be comparable. Just to do a quick little regulatory runaround, and then I'd like to save a few minutes for questions. I believe the sustainable fund disclosure came out in March. Also, there's a non-financial reporting standard that's been updated. And then significant work is ongoing as pertains to the EU. And the EU has, as I mentioned, the ECB has issued guidance on climate and environmental risks. They've also run a pilot exercise to look at exposures and losses within the Eurozone under different climate events. And a number of European peers, whether the Banque de France, which had run a scenario exercise earlier this year, or Denmark's central bank, which is also developing a stress test, all of them are thinking about what is the overall storyline and what does this mean for our work. And I think the broad answer for both Ireland and the EU is this means greater climate ambition. It means greater investment in making the necessary transformative changes, but it also means potentially greater transition risks for the particular institutions that need to align their activities or minimize their emissions. Just quickly on the US and Asia, as well as a little bit on Canada, what we can see is activity beginning to pick up in the United States, of course, an important financial hub. There have been a number of useful reports, one from the CFTC, the Commodities Futures Trading Commission, on climate risks. There was also a move to mandate stress testing and disclosures. That is still in process, but is one of the areas that is being looked at. The Bank of Canada ran a scenario exercise, and then the Asian countries very often are beginning to issue TCFDs, with the exception of Japan, which has issued a number of them from their financial institutions over the past several years. Two important organizations to think about when thinking about the regulatory pace setting are the Network for Greening the Financial System, which I mentioned. It's a peer learning network of almost 100 financial institutions, including now the US Fed, the ECB, also the Banque de France and the Bank of England, which are critically important. And the desire is for their guidances to provide a strong view on what types of disclosures are necessary without being the standard setter themselves. So by providing explicit guidance to central banks, there's an ability to make that into an emergent standard. There's also on the Bank of International Settlements, kind of a little bit more from the traditionalist lens. This group, the Basel team, was largely the ones that looked at a lot of the capital requirements in the 90s and 2000s. And that's sort of the approach in the world that they come from. So there's a real desire in that approach to push forward with improving better measurement of climate risks, and also of thinking about some of the key drivers. So just ahead of the Conference of Parties, which you likely have been made aware of, happening in Glasgow in early November, there's a lot of excitement because of the number of net zero commitments that have been made. There's a lot of expected coordination between governments and other key stakeholders. There's also a really key importance to understanding where exposures are, because not only will you be asked by regulators, but increasingly stakeholders, whether customers, investors, or others in society, are asking about these risks. Then I would also say that given the work of the TCFD, there'll be a number of new metrics that are likely to come out and help inform the conversation. And then finally, more and more institutions are raising their game by bringing in experts, by being able to really think about, okay, where is the data we need? Seeing a flood of providers on the market means that there's quite a lot of opportunity for institutions to shop around and get a sense of who is doing this type of climate work. So what I would say on the big meeting so far, the G7 announced support for climate risk disclosures. The Bank of England is presently running a stress test. The NGFS recently released new scenarios that are designed to be both more realistic and more detailed. We'll talk about that in a couple of sessions. And the TCFD has just released a consultation on metrics as well as target setting that it's keen for people to opine on. So realizing we only have a couple minutes left, and I don't want to run over for the break, I am keen to just see if there's maybe one, perhaps two questions. And then after that, we'll take about a 10-minute hiatus, and then have my colleague Maheen join us for the subsequent session.
Hello, David. I wonder, could I ask a question? Cormac Madden, ESB. Listen, thanks very much for the presentation so far. My question is, you showed some interesting climate information for Ireland early on. And I'm just wondering, is there generally accepted climate impact kind of information available for Ireland? And how far has that developed? It would be very useful for people if there was like a common set of data we could use to measure the physical climate. So thanks.
Yes. So there's a number of efforts underway on that topic. There's what's called the Climata Project, which brings together a number of climate modelers, all sort of submitting data. There's also within the NGFS and I'm wondering if I can share my screen on this. But there's this I wouldn't say is the end all, but it's an analytics tool that is partnered with the NGFS called what's called Climate Analytics, and it can look at different countries. One of the challenges can sometimes be for countries like Ireland that you may not have as much data, but I'm going to just share quickly for the group so you can see. This is one of the newest releases from the work with the NGFS. Is if you go to climateimpactexplorer.com, or if you just go to Climate Analytics, you can select Ireland. This is a good place to start when you're really looking for deep geocoded data. We'll talk a little bit more about that in some of the subsequent sessions about where we find that kind of data. But this can be a helpful way of looking up some of the information, different indicators, air temperature. Some of these things are going to be more interesting or less interesting, but you can see, and then by different NGFS scenarios. So I would just certainly recommend this as a starting resource. It's not necessarily the thing that you will build your physical risk models off, but it is certainly, to my mind, a helpful place to start.